Kia ora koutou, welcome to this presentation on the Catholic Church in New Zealand and the history of the Catholic Church in New Zealand. Okay, so the key things that we need to know is that the Catholic Church in New Zealand really came from France. It came from Lyon, and that's the picture that we have here is the shrine of Our Lady of Fourvière. It's in Lyon. And the key thing that's happening in France at this time that influences the missionaries to come out to Oceania, to New Zealand, is the French Revolution. So the French Revolution saw a great persecution of the Catholic Church in France, and conversely, sometimes when you persecute something, when something's difficult, people really make a commitment to it. So we see these religious orders pop up who have a real fervor for spreading the good news about Jesus Christ and aren't afraid to lay down their lives to do so. Particularly, we see the Marist Fathers, the Marist Brothers, and the Mission Sisters all consecrated themselves to Our Lady at this shrine, to Our Lady of Fourvière. And we can trace our journey backwards from this time also. So each of the bishops of Lyon were consecrated by the bishop before them, and that goes right back to the time of Saint Irenaeus, who was martyred in Lyon. Irenaeus was the disciple of Saint Polycarp, and Saint Polycarp was the disciple of the Apostle John. So we have that line of apostolic succession, and Bishop Pompallier, who was a Marist father, he made his way out to New Zealand. Christians were already here before the missionaries got here. The very first ones were in the whaling stations in places like Akaroa, but they didn't really make a permanent settlement here. There were other missionary groups such as the Wesleyans, the Anglicans, who made it here before the Catholics. The Catholics were relatively late on the scene, and there were different sort of places where the different sort of groups focused on, and they were focused on evangelizing the Māori people, not so much the settlers to start with. So the key place for the Catholics is the Hokianga, and that's I guess really important for us. The Hokianga Harbour is where you had the first mass on land in New Zealand, and the first Catholic mission station, and it's still a really important pilgrimage site. The body of Bishop Pompallier is housed there. So most important early couple who we can look at are Thomas and Mary Poynton. They were a Catholic couple, Catholic Irish stock. They settled in the Hokianga Harbour. And you have to imagine settling in a place, if you're a strong Catholic and you don't have any priests, then it's quite a sacrifice. You don't have access to the Mass or the sacraments. So they would gather on Sundays and bring their whole community together, along with some of the local Māori as well, and pray. But they were really instrumental in bringing priests over. They kept writing to the Archbishop of Sydney, who was there at the time. They went over to Sydney to get their children baptized. So they were really keen on getting the Catholic Church and the Catholic missionaries and priests into New Zealand. And they got their wish. So Bishop Pompallier, who was a Marist father, he was commissioned with the mission for Oceania, so that's a lot of the Pacific Islands as well as New Zealand, one of the biggest dioceses in the world. He was ordained a bishop and sent over here with a number of his brothers. So this is the start of the Catholic mission in New Zealand, and it's quite a journey to get over here, a good 4 or 5 months by boat. That's really, I guess, a key thing. Bishop Pompallier was a charismatic figure. He was certainly somebody who was very much about spreading the gospel of Jesus. He made a lot of personal sacrifices. He didn't end up dying in New Zealand. He went back to France, but he really loved New Zealand. He made a lot of journeys on foot over mountains to make it to different Maori tribes or different groups of settlers, and he had a lot of contact with the Pacific as well. So he had a schooner called the Santa Maria that he would use to make journeys to the Pacific Islands or around New Zealand. And he had to sort of so this is also around this time that St. Peter Chanel was martyred in Fortuna, the island of Fortuna. So he had to sort of organize, sending people back to Fortuna to claim the body, and that whole island of Fortuna was actually converted through the death, in fact, of St. Peter Chanel. So, as we've said, Bishop Pompalia's body is a site of pilgrimage. It's in Pangaru, so just in this area. One really important thing that Bishop Pompalia did was he was instrumental in adding something to the Treaty of Waitangi. So the Treaty of Waitangi, of course, is the founding document of New Zealand, and it was really important to Pompalia, with his experience of discrimination in France, or religious discrimination, that all religions have the freedom to practice their religion. So he wrote to the governor before the signing of the treaty and said, can you include this in the treaty? And it was included as an official fourth article. It was read as part of the treaty, which is actually makes it part of the agreement. So after the sort of signing of the treaty, it was sort of read, the state will respect the religious beliefs of Anglicans, Wesleyans, Catholic, and Māori, because those were the groups in New Zealand at the time. So this has a lot of implications for New Zealand going forward. Our founding document really says that religious freedom, freedom of conscience, should be respected, and people should be allowed to practice their religions, which is not the case in a lot of places. So that is an effect that Bishop Pompalia and the Catholic Church had in terms of the founding of New Zealand. After the signing of the treaty, we had a lot of settlers coming into New Zealand, and unfortunately what happens with the Māori mission stations is that the settlers' voices were louder in terms of needing priests, and so basically the priests were pulled out of the Māori missions, which were actually quite successful at the time, and brought over to the settlers, and a particular one was the Akaroa mission, which is a mission for the French settlers who were there. To make up for the lack in those communities, those Māori communities that had become Catholic, Māori katakita, or catechists, teachers, they were sort of in charge of those communities. They kept the faith alive in those communities, and there were some very important Māori catechists, and some of the really important Māori Catholic families to sort of trace their line back to one of these catechists. So that was how the faith was kept alive in this area. Pompalia was really good at incorporating Māori culture and Māori language into the Catholic Church, and this is something called enculturation. So enculturation is the process of rather than just taking a European culture and saying that European culture is the Catholic culture, it's adapting the not the essentials of the Catholic faith, but what is just, convention or tradition with a small t, and maybe changing up the mass or something like that, the just the expression of the mass, so that the people of the local place can, I guess, more readily understand, accept, and take on board the Catholic faith. So he was quite good with this. He wrote a Māori catechism. He also taught the sisters who he brought over. So he made several trips back to Europe to raise funds and bring more priests and nuns over. And the real key thing is that he was able to teach the nuns te reo on the voyage back, because it's quite a long voyage. So he was certainly keen on bringing Māori culture into the Catholic Church, and unfortunately, after he passed away, that some of this was lost, and some priests weren't quite so keen on it. So that's one, I guess, missed opportunity in the Catholic Church in New Zealand. Bishop Pompallier brought Suzanne Aubert over to New Zealand. Suzanne Aubert was somebody who wanted to become a nun. And so she started a community of nuns in New Zealand, and these are the Sisters of Compassion. She worked a lot with the local Māori communities, and just was a very holy and very sort of forthright woman. She had some of the first Māori nuns in New Zealand in her congregation. And her cause for canonization, so becoming a saint, is well underway with the Vatican. So she may be the first saint that we have who actually lived in New Zealand. As the settlers came in, we sort of had a change in the church. The church started as something that was Māori and French in New Zealand, but it quickly became an Irish church. Now, most of the people coming into New Zealand were English or also Scottish, and there was a minority of Irish coming in. Ireland was very Catholic, so if you're Irish and you're coming in, you're probably Catholic. And there was a real tension between the English Protestants, Anglicans, who I guess were often associated with the government in New Zealand, and the Irish Catholics, who in Ireland really felt oppressed by the English, and there was a real sort of both political and religious conflict between the Catholic Irish and the Protestant English, which would take a lot more than this lesson to go through. But these tensions continued when the Irish came to New Zealand. So that sort of it was a big thing, I guess, in the early parts of the church. And so things like the basilica that we have, the cathedral in Christchurch, that was built on what many people would consider, not so good land out of the center of the city, because that was the land that Catholics could get. They weren't really allowed into the center of Christchurch. There was discrimination that went both ways, but certainly even up into the early 1900s, there were adverts for jobs in the paper that said Catholics need not apply. So there was that religious tension was brought over to New Zealand. So that's a factor that influenced the early church in New Zealand, the early Catholic Church. The Irish brought with them, I guess, certain focuses on particular things. So one of the focuses was on, because they didn't have political power in Ireland for many years, and they sort of didn't have a way of, I guess, self-governing. They kind of wanted to at least show that they were more moral than their English rulers. So there was a real push to emphasize purity, and I guess in terms of moral purity, and that they did things well. There was an emphasis on the four last things, so death, judgment, heaven, hell, purgatory. So all of these things were preached about a lot. And interestingly, early in New Zealand history, there were a lot of campaigns for prohibition of alcohol, but the Irish, being good Catholics, who realized that created things can be used, have their proper uses, including alcohol. They campaigned against prohibition. So the Catholics, possibly you have the Catholics to thank that prohibition never really took hold in a big way in New Zealand, a prohibition of alcohol. The Irish group, the Mill Hill Fathers, came in 1886, and they were really important because they plugged some of the gaps that were left in the Māori mission, and so many. I think some of the last of the Mill Hill Fathers are probably heading into their 90s at the moment in New Zealand, but many came over. They manned the Māori missions, and they were really sort of central pillars in those communities. 1 second. And we have light again. So that was, I guess, one of the interesting things in the Irish Church is that we have one of the only places in the world where a bishop was tried for sedition or stirring up the people against the government, and all that the bishop had said was, we pray for those Irish people who had been shot by the unjust aggressors, meaning the British soldiers in Ireland, in the Easter Uprising over there. And that was deemed as very inflammatory. He was found not guilty, but you can sort of see that there was a lot of tension there. Sedition could have actually had him hanged, so we could have had one of our bishops put to death. So that's an interesting sort of aside. Now, some of this religious tension really affected the way that Catholic schools were founded. Okay, so Catholics really through all time have found that education, and a Catholic education, is really important. So when the missionaries came in, they set up parishes, but they set up schools. And like our school is a good example. We were set up really early on, 1868, 1888 for the precursor to Xavier College. So schools have always been very important for the Catholic Church. Now, there was a bit of politics around this. The New Zealand Education Act was passed through a reasonably Protestant Parliament in 1877, and there was a bit of concern that mostly that the Catholics will, they shouldn't be part of the education system. We shouldn't be sort of teaching sectarian religious ideas in state schools. So the rule was that religion should be free, secular, and compulsory, so open for everybody, and everybody should be doing it. So secular is the important part there, that it should be non-religious, and the Catholics are like, no, that we can't really accept that. So there was a lot of energy put into a Catholic schooling system. So that's really, I guess, a real key thing. They wanted a system that could cater for their religious beliefs as well. So a lot of Catholic money like from ordinary Catholics, was put into this system. And so this was reasonably easy when we had a lot of religious orders to staff these schools, but it became a lot harder over time. So we had the ladies, the Sisters of Our Lady of the Mission, who came over. We had the Josephites were really important in this, the Marist brothers, Marist fathers. Slowly, the view of Catholics, or the fight between Catholics and Protestants in New Zealand, started to change. So we had a number of Catholic prime ministers. One of the most famous of those was Michael Joseph Savage, and he brought in, at the time of the Great Depression in New Zealand, so when people were really struggling, he brought in something called social welfare, which is, I guess, our system of safety nets, like benefits for those who have lost their jobs or who can't work. And he called this, he said this was applied Christianity. This is how he expressed his faith in politics. So this is an effect, again, of Catholic teaching and the Catholic thought. In the meanwhile, the Catholic schools were starting to struggle to cope with their numbers and struggle to staff the schools with their people. So this is where we get the idea of state integration. Eventually, the state came up with a compromise because they didn't want all the Catholic schools to close because they couldn't cope with all the students. And so the compromise was made that basically the state will fund the teachers and the learning. This church will look after the buildings, and there will be the New Zealand curriculum will be taught, but it will be taught with a Catholic special character. And this now applies to other religions also. So that's where what we call the integrated school comes from. This is also a huge effect. This hasn't happened in all countries. A lot of countries have private Catholic schools. So this is actually a huge part of the Catholic Church in New Zealand. What is the Catholic Church like today? Well, it's multicultural, perhaps a bit smaller than it was. It is involved in, social issues such as euthanasia or the environment, poverty, and the bishops and groups like Caritas put out statements about this. It's a church that is greatly changing. It is the largest denomination of Christians in New Zealand, but partially because of immigration. And maybe also because of the Catholic schools. So this is something that you can go out and do your research on, but that's a start for the Catholic Church in New Zealand.